I love honey. I do not like, however, when honey gets on my fingers because it's just so darn sticky and it takes so long for it to get rid of it. However, when it comes to storytelling, you want it to be sticky. In fact, that's what makes stories so interesting because they're so sticky. Today, we're going to explore what makes for a great business story. How can we make it sticky? Recently, I baked a cake. The cake only had a number of ingredients, but guess what? I forgot the eggs. It turned out into a hot mess. It was just this clump of nothingness. You know, when it comes to building a really riveting business story, there are 4 ingredients, and you better have those 4 ingredients because if you miss one out, it's going to be a clump. Today, let's explore the 4 ingredients that makes a compelling business story. Human beings, from the very beginning of their existence, have been telling stories to each other. In fact, there's evidence to suggest that we were depicting stories on cave walls before we even had language. Such is the power of story. And in many ways, you know, stories are powerful because that's the way we explain meaning to each other. When you think about it, you go out for the day, you have different experiences, you come back, and what do we say to each other? How was your day? And so what we say is a series of different stories that happen. We make meaning through story. And so stories have this primordial power. They can convey a message in a way that no other format can do. So it's incredibly important for businesses as well to have a way of telling their business story, a way of conveying what's at the core of why they do, and making those stories what I call as sticky as possible. Let's explore 4 ingredients that make those stories really sticky and compelling. So ingredient number 1 is characters. That's right. Every great story needs great characters. Now, here's the thing about characters. Characters do not need to be saints. Characters are not supposed to be perfect people. Why is that? Because at the core, characters need to be relatable. We need to be able to identify with the character because if we don't identify, guess what? We don't care. And so it's so important that when we have characters that we care about them. And so think about some of the great characters you've read about, you've seen in movies or TV. You know, even Superman, even the great characters, they're not perfect people. They all have their flaws. Why? Because flaws make us human. And so when it comes to the protagonist, that's the person, the hero of the story, it's incredibly important, especially if it's yourself, that it is not perfect, that it is human, that it has flaws, but most importantly, that it is relatable. Now, any good story as well needs another type of character, and that's what we call the protagonist. Oh, that's the person who raises up the ante, that creates a little bit of the tension. Now, protagonists as well are really important. And why is protagonists important? Because they make stories interesting. Can you imagine a story without a protagonist? How boring would that story be? So let's take one of the most famous movie franchises in history, Star Wars. I don't know how many there have been, 20, 30? Who knows? We're still going on. Can you imagine Star Wars without Darth Vader, without an antagonist? Without a person who is raising up that tension? What would it be? It would just be Luke Skywalker flying from planet to planet, having nice little visits, going to a few pubs, etc. But with Darth Vader, whoa, we have a story. So the antagonist is important. And really what's important about the antagonist as well is that it doesn't necessarily need to be just a person. It can be a thing or an object. You know, some of the most powerful ads that really grab us emotionally is St. Jude's Children's Hospital. Now, who's the antagonist there? It's not a person, it's a disease. It's cancer. Cancer is the antagonist. We're out for a fight against cancer, or it's a disease that we're out to win against. No matter what, we need to spend a lot of time on the characters of the story. We need to find out, are they interesting? Are they relatable? And we need characters that introduce some tension which we'll get into in some of the next points. So point number 2 is this, is that we need to be very deliberate in the setup of the story. That's right. We live in an age where people get bored easily. In fact, I hope you've stayed along just to this point in YouTube now, because I know some people started and they went off. Because we have to attract attention, and any story has to. Any story has to grab us from the beginning because our attention frames are getting less and less. Did you ever watch a crime drama? You ever watch the first minute? What happens in that first minute? Oh, it's not someone just driving along or a nice little conversation. No, it's someone driving along and all of a sudden they have an accident or something happens or there's an explosion or something. They want to grab us. That setup is incredibly important. It draws us in, and we have less and less time to do that because of people's attention frame. A few months ago, I was working with a group of doctors, and we were talking on presentation skills and the use of stories. And so one doctor who'd done a lot of research in diabetes and really was passionate about his topic. And so he was making his presentation, and at the beginning, he was giving some statistics and findings, et cetera, et cetera. And some of the feedback we gave him was, this is great, but it's not grabbing us. How can we grab us? What does these statistics mean? And so where he went with that, he came back the next day and he told us a story about Cynthia, a young girl who had diabetes, and how that impacted her life and the life of her family. Let me tell you, it was grabbing from the very beginning. Because you can give all the statistics you want, and all of a sudden you put it in a story and it becomes real. It becomes an experience. And because he did that at the very beginning, the setup drew us in. We were hooked. And we wanted to know more about Cynthia. We wanted to know more about the disease that she was fighting. We wanted to know how it would turn out. Perfect. So be careful about the setup and make sure that you are giving people an opportunity to stay focused, to be connected, and most of all, are interested. And part of that interest, of course, comes from great characters, but then also great characters that have something happen to them. Number 3 is every sticky story, every great story, every story in the history of the world has this. It is conflict. Conflict is critically important when it comes to a story. Why is conflict important? Conflict's important because it is inherently interesting. Now, you may not like conflict. You may hate to be in conflict. But let me tell you, if I give you a bowl of popcorn and you're sitting in front of a TV, you love conflict because conflict's interesting. Conflict brings all this emotionality. Think about when we're in conflict. Think about the passion that happens. Think about the tension it creates. And so every story has to have this conflict. Our main character has to encounter an issue, a problem, something that they have to overcome. Because that overcoming is part of our human reality. That overcoming is interesting. And so when you explore your story, it's really important to ask, where is the conflict? Is this conflict enough to make people draw them in, make them want to listen? Final ingredient when it comes to creating a sticky story is this. Number 4, there has to be a resolution to the conflict. Here we've created this conflict, we have our characters in the conflict, and we also have to have a resolution. Now, if you've ever noticed, and I'm sure you have, if you watch the series, and I'm sure you have, you will notice this, that why is it at the end of the program there's some tense moment that we don't know what's going to happen? The most famous in the history of the world was, who shot JR? Listen to the tension that created. People were gripped with that. And what was happening there? People needed resolution. We need to know what happens. And so it's really important, if a story is going to be truly sticky, if a story is going to have meaning, that we have resolution to that story. That's really important, you know. I find sometimes that people tell stories in a half-hearted way, or they don't tell it fully. And I always say this, if you're telling a story and you are leaving some questions unanswered, then you may go on in your presentation or where you are at. However, people are still stuck because they are looking for the resolution. So when you are crafting your story, you're crafting your characters to set up the conflict they're in, it's really important to ask, do I resolve the questions that were brought up? Do I give people resolution to the questions that they have? And you may have to practice your story quite a few times and ask people, is there anything unresolved in the telling of the story? Because if we can resolve everything, then it leaves people a peace of mind and they're able to move on. If we don't have a resolution, they're stuck in the middle of that story with unanswered questions. So there you have it. Ingredients for a great story. There are 4 that are critical. Your characters, your setup, your conflict, and then resolution. Have these 4 elements done in a really great way and you will have a killer story that is sticky and attaches to people. If you've enjoyed this video, I really invite you to watch the next one, which is all about overcoming fear in public speaking.